Welcome back. So this topic is going to talk about how to create a 3-column page layout web page. As you can see from the PowerPoint slide looking at us in front of you here, the idea here is that there's a header going all the way across the top of the screen and 3 main columns going through the center of the screen. Contained with all of this is the container, otherwise known as the wrapper. The idea that the nav container, the main container, and the aside container are not nested within one another. In fact, they are all separate. The process to configuring this properly within the CSS is to identify the total width of the left side column and tell it to float to the left. Next, in the HTML, we want to identify the right column exists, which for us is called the aside, and it also has a set width of 200 pixels in this case, and we tell it to float to the right. The next thing you'll see inside the HTML is going to be the center column, which we've called main. What happens here is that main will try to find its way to scooch up to the center area right here, based on the nav being floated to the left and the aside being floated to the right. The main will move on up. In addition, any other content thereafter, such as the footer, will also start to scooch on up into the main section as well. Lastly, you'll see here in the code on the left is that the margins are specified to ensure that the main container does not float or to take up any space underneath the nav, especially since, if you can envision, the navigation bar, such as over here, has only this much content being utilized, and so by the main container having the ability to scooch on up, without giving it a margin on the left-hand side, what it will do is it will start to display some of this content underneath the nav that is no longer being used by, in this case, the hyperlinks as well as the image. Therefore, the way the margin is set up is this is the top, so there's a 0 margin at the top. The 210 pixels is referring to the right side. As you know, the right side column, also called the aside, has a width of 200 pixels, so by us giving it a 10 pixel error of caution or error margin, that ensures that the content will not be on top of the right side, aside section. The next 0 is referring to the bottom margin, and then the left side is referring to 160 pixels, again 10 pixels more than the set width specified for the nav. Let's take a look at our code now and see if we can make sense of this and try it out. If we look at our HTML code on the left-hand side over here, we can see that we have our wrapper specified, we have our header, we have our navigation, and then we have the main. We also have the aside container at the bottom. So currently, when you look at the actual web page in its current state, here's the navigation, here's the main, and here's the right sidebar as identified by the text right here. So let's go into the CSS and see if we can make sense of this and start to move things to the left and to the right. When we click on the CSS, when we come down to the nav section, we can see the nav is largely emptied. So let's do what we just saw in the previous slide and specify a width of 150 pixels. We also want to tell the nav to float to the left. Let's save our changes and see the adjustments. In addition, I'm also going to provide myself with a background color of yellow, and I realize I won't keep that background color as it's specified. I'm just utilizing it so I can see the different blocks of content in my web page. So here's now the navigation on the left-hand side. So it's done a nice job of specifying the width, and it moved it over to the left, or floated to the left. So as you can see, the lighthouse, which is a part of the main content area, is starting to scooch up into the main section over here. A couple things about this now. Let's go through and modify our navigation while we are in here. And again, for the navigation, I'm also going to specify that we have a font weight of bold, and we can get rid of this color of yellow. Nice. Lastly, let's do one more attention to detail and do letter spacing. And let's specify the letter spacing to 0.1 EMs. And so it spread out our letters just a little bit, which is a nice little attention to detail there. The next thing we need to look at is going to be our main and aside. As you can see, both of these containers exist, but nothing is inside of them yet. So as we know with the aside, we told it that we would have a width of 200 pixels, and we were going to tell it to float to the right. And then lastly, let's give it a background color of red, just so that way we can see it again, and then we can always remove it. So I've refreshed the page. Remove the hashtag in front of the word aside in your CSS, because as you can see, aside is a known HTML tag, so there's no need for that hashtag to be present. Make sure you save both the HTML file and the CSS file, and then refresh your page. And here you can now see the right side bar is over on the far right side. It's 200 pixels wide, but it's underneath the main content area. Now, as I mentioned before, the main content is doing a fine job of moving itself upwards. However, the order of operations within our HTML needs to modify. So let's take the whole aside container from beginning to end. I'm going to cut it out and paste it before the main begins. So now you can see we've got the nav, the aside, and then the main. Let's save our changes and refresh the page. And now we see that the right side bar is now present on the right and the navigation is on the left. Once again, I'm going to come back into that CSS. I shouldn't have removed that background color. It's great for you to debug with. Let's do green this time. On the navigation container, and you can see that it's over there on the left. So as promised, the content from main is starting to move up into this left side column, which we really don't want to do. So once again, if we come back to our CSS and go into the main section, one of the first things that we saw we could do is set up our margins. And the top will be set to 0. The right side will be set to 210 pixels. The bottom will be set to 0. And the left will be set to 160 pixels. And again, that's 10 pixels more than the actual container sizes themselves. And here we go. Now you can see that the full navigation bar will be completely open from any content from the main section to be contained within the main section. The right side will stay on the right side. Looking good. Nice job. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is CSS styling for print. As you can see here in the slide, we can have multiple links to different style sheets, one for display to the media, which is going to be your screen, and one for print purposes. Have you ever gone to a website and you wanted to print it out, and when you go to press a link at the top that says click here for print, and it opens up a very different looking web page than what you were just looking at? Possibly what happens is that we turn off the navigation. When you go to print out a web page, there's really no need for your navigation bar to be displayed. So things of that will get turned off so we don't even see them. Or other ads that are oftentimes on the right hand side can also be turned off from being displayed when you go to print out the actual web page. So the idea of the CSS for print is unique to that. The media over here on the right hand side is specified for print, and then obviously the media for the CSS used for the screen is specified to screen. Now, if you only have one link specified for one CSS file, having media equals screen is not required. The minute you start adding in multiple style sheets for different medias, then you do need to specify the media type. So therefore, your print doesn't get confused with your display, as the browser doesn't understand the file name specified as wildfire print. It only knows that there's multiple CSS files, and the last one listed here, again, if it's not specified for the specific media, we'll pick up on the CSS that is specified on the last listed style sheet. So be sure that you specify the media whenever you have multiple style sheets for different platforms. So when it comes for, as I just mentioned, creating a CSS for print purposes, you really should turn off the nav, so therefore it's not being displayed at all. Likewise, for any images that are of large color differences or non-essential information, you can turn those off as well. In addition, you'll see over here at the bottom here that if we have a particular hyperlink, we could always display what the actual hyperlink is. So therefore, a person that wants to see what the hyperlink is when they go to print it out, since the link won't actually be clickable up here in the actual web page, you can specify the code that you see at the bottom here, where it says content colon quotation mark, and then we see that there's a parenthesis on the left and then a quotation mark because we do specify our href equals, and there's the href reference, and then a right parenthesis, a quotation, a right parenthesis, and a quotation semicolon. Whenever you see this, what it does, it displays the attribute of whatever is specified in the href to be displayed to the print screen, so therefore the person that prints it out can see what it looks like. Moving on, as we create a website for the large screen, we also need to keep in mind what a person might see when they utilize a tablet or a mobile device. So things such as a smaller screen size suggest that maybe we should be using less data, so don't download all the images. Have limited choice of fonts or colors that are being used, or awkward controls or itty-bitty little links that are hard to press with our fingers on a touchscreen device. Most cell phones don't have a flash player supported, so therefore make sure any content you have displayed there is not using SWIFT files, which requires flash player. Instead, use animated GIFs or images of that sort. As recommended by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, there's a link right here in which you can find out some of the best practices. We encourage you to optimize your layout, your navigation, and graphics for mobile use. We are designing it for one web, meaning that we design it for the PC, the tablet, and for the mobile device, but we're using different CSS files to display it for different devices. What you can see listed right here is the best optimized layout for mobile use. As you can see right here, here's the wrapper, and it's going to be set to 100%. As you know from our own Java Jam files and Lighthouse files, we currently have our wrapper set to 80%, and we see the gutters on the left and on the right. This is passive white space that we put there purposefully, but it keeps the content within the page nice and contained. When we move to a smaller device, it's not advisable to waste space with this passive white space on the left and on the right. Rather, we want to use up as much of the real estate that's available to us as possible. In addition, we encourage you to use lists such as unordered lists and ordered lists, whether you display the 1, 2, 3 or the bullet points or nothing at all, like we currently do for our navigation bar. Avoid using tables. Now, we haven't talked about tables at this point, but keep that in mind as we move forward and we do talk about tables. Having a table displayed in a mobile device doesn't allow you to have scalability of the page, such as when we change the resolution from large to small, we can see the content is doing a natural word wrap based on the size of the resolution. When you have a table, that doesn't work so well. So avoid using tables when you're going to be displaying it for mobile use. In addition, we always want to provide labels for your form controls, and again, we'll talk about labels more when we talk about form controls in future exercises and videos. Avoid using a set specific unit size whenever possible. So you can see it in our navigation, in our CSS file, sometimes we specify pixels, and that's okay when we're talking about padding or margins, but it's not advisable to use a set size when it comes to font size, or in this case the letter spacing or line spacing, it's best to be based on percentages, which will allow your information to modify based on the resolution size, which is proportionate to the device or the display size. However, when you start using absolute sizes such as pixels, that relative understanding goes to the wayside, and so it becomes an absolute display, which doesn't allow people to use their fingers to stretch in or to skew outwards. Some additional optimization ideas is to provide minimum navigation. As you can see in this little demonstration right here, the navigation goes across the top. It doesn't go horizontal, it becomes vertical. So keep that in mind that we also will want to do that when we start modifying our web page for mobile use. Avoid hyperlinks that open into new windows. Earlier in this chapter, we talked about using the target equals underscore blank, which would allow us to have a file open up into a new web page. For example, where does it come from? As you recall in a previous video and earlier in the chapter, when I click on this link, it opens up in a new web page. Here's the original one. However, what we're saying for mobile devices is that whenever you have a hyperlink, you likely will want to keep it maintained on the current web page. So keep that in mind when you're designing for mobile versus PC. And we can toggle between the two based on the understanding of what the width is and the sizes of the resolution. You also want to avoid displaying large images that are wider than the screen or not necessary in general, such as this lighthouse image right here. It's lovely and it is attractive and it engages the user to see the visual of what the lighthouse looks like. However, when we move to a mobile device, that's a large image to download and it takes up a lot of real estate, forcing us to always have to scroll past it, which is not ideal. If you do have an image, make sure you provide alternative text should a user not be able to download the image, or they choose not to download the image due to data size. They can at least see what the alt tag was on the image tag. Refer back to chapter 4 when we talk about images, what the alt tag is. In addition, as always, make sure you're always configuring for good contrast between text and background colors, especially on mobile devices. Whenever we're building a website for computer use inside of an office or a home, contrast of colors is still extremely important for accessibility purposes, but it's less of an issue because you're not likely to be looking at the screen in a sunny environment or in a dark environment or a non-well-lit environment. However, when we build websites for mobile devices, it's pretty much a guarantee that you can be looking at your website from any place at any time in any lighting, and so you want to make sure that you are using common font types as well as a good contrast of colors between the background and the foreground color contrasts. Next thing is, in the meta tags, you can also specify what the viewport sizing is, and so it basically establishes an initial scale of 1.0. You'll see in our actual file over here, at the very top of the screen, I have a meta tag, and so for that meta tag, I've provided the name equals viewport, and then the content equals, in this case, we're specifying the device width is set to an initial scale of 1.0. You can change the scale amount to different devices, but realistically, my very first CSS that's going to be recognized is going to be for a PC, and so that really is my 1.0 scale. And I'm also using an understanding that the resolution will change in size, and so we want to keep it based on the 1.0 scale depending on the pixel sizes and the percentages that you're using. If you go changing this value from the scale 1.0 to 0.5 or to 2.0, you're basically specifying it's at 200% or at 50% up front, and therefore when we change things based on percentages or M's, it throws off the amount in which it skews, so leaving it at 1.0 is quite ideal. Next thing we're going to talk about is what CSS3 media queries are. And basically the CSS media query identifies what the maximum or minimum width is of the current screen, and based on that information it will change the resolution layout of your content. We'll talk about this more in the next video.